Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Keese School. I'm Kate Harrison, the Associate Dean. Sandy Mack, our presenter tonight, has been a regular contributor to the Keese School in recent years, giving daytime classes on a number of Shakespeare's plays, as well as evening lectures. Tonight, he will focus on the Bard and some of his buddies who were literary stars in their own right. Sandy honed his skills as a professor at both Harvard and the University of Maryland. And anyone who has taken Sandy's classes knows what a wonderful teacher he is for both the young and the not so young. Sandy is also a driving force behind the Senior Olympics medal-winning bocce team here at Asbury. We are fortunate that he and his wife Elaine decided to make Asbury their home.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate Harrison, Frank Snyder, Donna Marino, Bill Brown, Jesse Galliani, June Kim, Dave Reiser, all the ushers, and about 60 other people who make Keese possible. The crown jewel of Asbury. Think about it, lining up 24 talks every semester, plus day classes. I work 2 open houses regularly, and I can attest, prospective residents are stunned by the Keese offerings. Boy, Rusty Bryant certainly set a high bar last week. Such exciting, open, explorative science. Clearly, he has forgotten more chemistry than I never knew. I discovered on working on this talk that my first Keese talk was back in 1998. I, of course, was just 8 years old, a simple country Shakespeare teacher at the University of Maryland. And Lee Bachrach, now of Parkview and then of Villas, invited me out in the afternoon of May 15th to give a talk on King Lear 27 years ago. When Elaine and I were looking for CCRCs, some part of my lizard brain remembered the residents who attended were interested and engaged, right? I wanted to be a part of that. Luckily, Elaine and I are. So thank you, Lee, and thank you, Keese School. I'm delighted to be able to announce now that today is Shakespeare's birthday. The traditional birthday, April 23rd. We have no evidence whatsoever that he was born on April 23rd. He was christened on April 26th. He was baptized. That's what matters when you're eligible for the kingdom of heaven. When you're born doesn't matter. Baptismal records are kept in stone buildings, churches that burn less often than birth records that are kept in wooden houses that burn. We have absolutely no evidence that he was born on the 23rd of April. The reason we chose that was that he died on the 23rd of April. So surely England's greatest poet would be able to arrange his life to be a perfect circle. It's also true April 23rd is the saint day of King George, the patron saint of England. Surely England's greatest poet would be able to be born on the same day as England's patron saint. We have no evidence that all people were baptized quickly after they were born, lest they die unbaptized. So as of tonight, April 21st, not April 23rd. Preparing for tonight has been a story of the incredible shrinking buddies, fewer buddies. From the blurb, John Lilly, Thomas Kidd, Thomas Dekker, John Webster didn't make the cut, and I apologize. For years, I taught at Maryland a course called Shakespeare and His Contemporaries, and semester after semester, the students pled and then often insisted that we change the syllabus as we went along and had more Shakespeare and fewer buddies. Last to go was a play by Elizabeth Carey. I said to myself, Self, it's 2025. I really ought to include a play by a woman. And I tried. But women were simply not given the chance to write performable drama for the public theaters. Elizabeth Carey did write a play, The Tragedy of Miriam, Fair Queen of Jewry, only play written by a woman in the period that we know of, published in 1610, lost for 100 years, rediscovered, never performed as far as we know until very recently. But it's more a spirited intellectual debate about the role of women rather than a drama. Miriam herself is wonderfly radical. It's historically fascinating, but it's almost unreadable and unteachable. Just two lines from this play, fascinating in themselves. For in a wife, it is no worse to find a common body than a common mind. One of the things that leaps out at us, of course, is the idea that the male entirely controls the woman and knows what is legitimate and what isn't. But there is, in fact, embedded in those lines, isn't there, a rather revolutionary idea that perhaps sexual betrayal is not worse than personal emotional betrayal. For in a wife, it is no worse to find a common body than a common mind. It's entirely negative, but it raises the question of sex not being the only way in which betrayal occurs between human beings. Okay, super fast. 1660, after Shakespeare, to about 1960, the proscenium arch, the missing fourth wall. We sit there in the dark pretending we're not there, peering into the realistic, psychologically realistic stories, often a lot of sexual complications in them. New stories, we're often surprised by the endings. We and the actors agree that we all pretend we aren't there. This is less true in the last 50, 70 years, but certainly it was the basic model from the Restoration in 1660 up until the middle of the 20th century. Psychological realism over spiritual or religious or mythic dimensions. The exact opposite where Western drama began. Mythic, spiritual, only on religious holidays, attendance required for citizens. Man against a background of unchanging, sacred nature. Tragic man going down to defeat in front of the gods and their power. Totally known heroic stories acted out in ritualistic retelling. The actors wearing elevated shoes, which makes them move differently, speaking through masks. If any of you have been to the theater with a performance in masks, it is stunningly different. The unchanging face, speaking changing words. And right in the middle, Shakespeare's theater. A perfect balance between psychological realism and religious and mythic dimensions. In this, the enclosed playhouse. They were not called theaters, they were called playhouses, being done for money, not on religious occasions, quite the opposite, to make money. Semi-familiar stories with primarily horizontal, social, urban interactions with plenty of psychological realism played out against an architecture of wood, human-made background. Again, commercial, being done for money. The area above the stage was painted with the signs of the zodiac underneath and was called the heavens. The area under the stage, accessible by trapdoors, was called the hell. It's primarily a horizontal urban theater built by human beings and advertising that through the carvings in the woods, but it had a vertical dimension, a spiritual dimension that could be called on anytime it was needed. And we will see that dimension being called on in all three of the passages we're going to look at tonight. I love this picture because looming over on the left-hand side is the Industrial Revolution power of the Bankside Electrical Power Station by Sir Giles Scott, who also did the Battersea Power Station. If there are any Pink Floyd fans in the audience, that's the one on the cover of their Animals album. And then peeking in on the right, elegant, expensive apartments for oligarchs. We may tolerate you artsy folks, or we may crush you. Power versus art. Reality over fantasy down here, maybe. Kennedy Center recently, anyone? In all these theaters, today included, like religious ceremonies, you go on their schedule, not when you want to read a poem, not when you want to read the next chapter of that novel. You go on their schedule. All performance art works that way, of course, and that's important. Shared experience is fundamentally different. Here tonight. Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, is now 25 years old. Cable TV and social media have spun it wildly faster. And that's why being in the theater is so different and seeing Shakespeare in the theater is so different from watching him on TV. Theater is fundamentally democratic. You look in the theater anywhere you want. Film, video, is entirely totalitarian, autocratic. You see only and precisely only what the director wants you to see, chooses to put in the picture for you. London. Starting over here down on the bottom right, the Tower of London, this line is the wall, the old Roman wall. The area within is called the City of London. In this period, it's controlled by the Puritans, who hated theater, always hate theater, managed to close the theaters for 18 years in 1642, closed all the theaters in London. That's after Shakespeare. So none of the theaters, none of the playhouses are in here. They're outside in what are called the Liberties. Up, you'll see up here, and down across the river at the very bottom of the screen, Suffolk. We went in this time to hear a play more often than we went to see a play in the writings of the time, which puts the emphasis where it should be for this drama on the language itself. This is still a kind of late medieval culture, and entertainment is largely provided free in England at the time that Shakespeare and Marlowe are born in 1642. Some of it through the church, some of it from that kind of noblesse oblige as the wealthy put on festivals and celebrations for their workers, for the serfs, for their servants. There are really only 3 places in England at the time where you pay in advance. One of them is the theaters. You pay to get in for obvious reasons. The next, bear baiting. Yes, indeed, tie a bear to a stake, loose wild dogs on him, and after an exciting hour or two, the bear will have eviscerated the dogs with his massive claws. And the third place, of course, you pay in advance is brothels. Hangings and beheadings were free and were wildly popular. Vast numbers of the London population would turn out for a good beheading. Not on the map, a theater called the Red Lion. We don't know where it was. We know it existed in 1567. We know one play was put on there. That's all we know. But our history really begins in 1576. You can remember that 200 years before, right up there, in a building conveniently called the Theater. The theater came to be the term for these buildings. Nobody used it for these buildings then. They were called playhouses. This building was built by James Burbage, a carpenter who was the father of Richard Burbage, who became Shakespeare's lead actor and pretty much the leading actor in England at the time. He was a carpenter. He leased a piece of land up there and built himself a theater and put on plays in this playhouse. He called it the theater, but it's like the theater of North Africa in the Second World War, that kind of panorama sense of the word, not the way we think of it this way with people lined up in seats. Apparently it was so successful that a few years later he built another playhouse down here called the Curtain. Again, there was no proscenium arch. This is not a playhouse with a curtain that goes up. It refers to a curtain wall, another military term, a surround. An enclosure is what curtain means in Latin. And it was called in the contract an easer. So apparently on some occasions, they had enough people wanting to attend the playhouse called the Theater that they could put on a second play at the Curtain, a few hundred yards south, closer to the actual city walls. In 1598, the man who owned the land where the theater was located refused to renew the lease, thinking, I'm sure, that he had just won himself a active, successful playhouse. Well, on the 27th of December, in the middle of the winter, the owner of the property was out of town. Shakespeare and his company and the Burbages took that theater apart, carried all of the, just literally took it all apart, carried all the pieces down and stored them right around here on the north bank of the Thames until spring, when they carried them across and built the Globe. Listen to the titles, though: a theater, a panorama, curtain, an enclosure, and then the Globe. There's a real sense of the growing importance, or at least optimism, about theater in the names that we have. Shakespeare owned or contributed some of the money that allowed them to buy the property on the south side of the river down here, where they built the Globe. It then burned to the ground in 1613, but was rebuilt and was still operating when the theaters were closed in 1642. Already there was the Rose Theater. That was the theater where the Lord Admiral's men and Edward Allen, who was probably the second greatest actor in England after Richard Burbage, where they played. It's also where Marlowe and Johnson, the two people we're going to look at in just a minute, they wrote for that theater and acted in that theater. Johnson also acted in the Globe later on. The Swan was down there, and later the Hope, and then up slightly to the north here, a little bit later on, the Red Bull up here, and the Phoenix or Cockpit over here. The Fortune, that's a little bit of interest to us, it was a square theater because we have the contract for it, and so when the Folger Shakespeare Library wanted to build a smaller version of the theater, they built it on the basic shape of the Fortune Theater. Playhouses typified and exemplified the extraordinary growth in secular and capitalist life. Think about it. Until 1576, Shakespeare's 12 years old, Marlowe's 12 years old, people simply didn't pay to go and see a play, or essentially anything else except bear baiting. Never before in Western history had this happened. Like how exciting TV was in the late 40s and 50s, when there emerged a whole new commercial capitalist mode of expression and entertainment. When we were young, it was TV. When Shakespeare was young, it was the theater, a playhouse. However, TV really was the beginning of the separation, the isolation of folks. Now, of course, on steroids with smartphones and the internet and artificial intelligence. Not just bowling alone, not bowling at all, much less in the medieval guild-like bowling league some of you may have been members of in the 30s and 40s and 50s. It matters. Theater, like religion, brought and still brings people together. We are in this together, as one of my favorite political commentators says. Professional sports, whether in our corrupted colleges or openly professional sports, may be a part of our trying to find a substitute for religion, terrifying thought, for being in depth together. It's also a period of extraordinary language growth. More words came into the English language in this period than had since the Norman invasion in 1066, when all of the Norman French words joined our language. Shakespeare himself invented over 1,500 words. Majestic, manager, radiance, swagger, critic, generous, whole bunch of negatives, unaware, uncomfortable, undressed, uneducated, unwillingness, unsolicited, unreal, had never been said as far as we know, and people have been looking intensively for 200 years now. So we're probably pretty sure he invented these words. And how many phrases that had never been used before. Flaming youth, primrose path, to the manor born, the glass of fashion, hoist on his own petard, something rotten in the state of Denmark, it smells to heaven, the dog will have his day, my mind's eye, I love that. Think of the developing psychology that lies behind. I see it with my mind's eye. We're getting very complicated now. We are not a single thing. There's a mind's eye that sees its own things. There's the rub, this mortal coil, method in its madness, brevity is the soul of wit, as easy as lying, the whips and scorns of time, more matter and less art. The witching hour, neither a borrower nor a lender be, to thine own self be true, and those are all out of one play, Hamlet. Just a couple more. Wild Goose Chase, I love that. Star-crossed lovers, green-eyed monster, pomp and circumstance. Where would we be? Greek to me, a dish fit for the gods, a lean and hungry look, the milk of human kindness. I could go on and on. A period of stunning verbal originality, creativity, playfulness, energy, copia. Why use one word when you can use 10? The exact opposite of almost all of our teaching in writing, particularly government writing these days. So let's look at some of this wonderful verbal energy in action. Christopher Marlowe, born the same year as Shakespeare. Again, we know when he was christened, but not when he was born. That doesn't matter. Died 1593, well before Shakespeare, under very upsetting conditions. His father was a shoemaker. He went up to Cambridge and earned a BA, so clearly had some brains. Probably a spy, a brawler, a heretic, and was described as a magician, a duelist, a tobacco user, a counterfeiter, a rake-hell, these are all terms from the period, and a sodomite. The only term for being gay in this period, the concept of homosexuality, did not yet exist. Someone posted posters around London attacking the immigrant Protestants from France, immigrants again, nothing changes, from France and the Netherlands who'd settled in London. And it was in iambic pentameter and seemed to refer to some of the plays that Marlowe had already written. So the police rounded up Thomas Kidd, a guy who I had hoped to be part of this talk tonight, but who didn't make the cut. They tortured him, and he said, oh, yeah, but it's all Christopher Marlowe's fault. It may have been. Very soon after that, he was murdered in an unclear and confusing circumstances in an upstairs room in a tavern. Possibly a government disappearing act. He had gone rogue. Shakespeare pays tribute to him in As You Like It. Whoever loved that loves not at first sight is not a line of Shakespeare. It's a line of Christopher Marlowe that Shakespeare took wholesale, knowing many in his audience would recognize it. It was from a wonderful erotic poem called Hero and Leander, took that and put it in the mouth of one of his characters in As You Like It. He really had the first success with blank verse, iambic pentameter, 10 syllables, 5 beats, which became the main literary form for almost all of the great drama of this period. Robert Greene, a rascally writer and critic of the time, sort of made fun of the way Marlowe writes. He called it the spacious volubility of the drumming decasyllabon, which of course is a perfect line of iambic and pentameter. Decasyllabon, 10 syllables, the spacious volubility of the drumming decasyllabon. But Ben Jonson, the other guy we're going to look at in a minute, described it as Marlowe's mighty line. Tamburlaine was one of his plays, 1588. Story loosely based on a Central Asian emperor, Timur the Lame, hence Tamburlaine, 14th century. The plot, he challenges all of his neighbors and one by one beats them all. It's 2 plays, 10 acts of relentless victory on the part of Tamburlaine. He uses one as a step stool to get up on his throne. He puts a bit and bridle on several of his others and whips them, shouting, Hola, ye pampered jades of Asia. Another defeated ruler bashes his brains out on stage in despair. His only defeat is that his love, Xenocrate, dies. He wraps her in gold and takes him with her on his endless success of battles. Of course, he dies at the end. But this you have on your handouts. This is Tamburlaine explaining his modus operandi to Theridamas, one of the people he's defeated fairly early in the first play. The thirst of reign and sweetness of a crown that caused the eldest son of heavenly Ops to thrust his doting father from his chair and place himself in the imperial heaven moved me to manage arms against thy state. What better precedent than mighty Jove? Nature that framed us of four elements, warring within our breasts for regiment, thus teach us all to have aspiring minds. Our souls whose faculties can comprehend the wondrous architecture of the world and measure every wandering planet's course, still climbing after knowledge infinite and always moving as the restless spheres, will us to wear ourselves and never rest until we reach that ripest fruit of all, that perfect bliss and soul felicity, the sweet fruition of an earthly crown. This is soaring stuff, isn't it? Ranging from drawing on heavenly examples of Ops, that's just Jupiter in another language, aspiring minds. It's very American, constantly striving forward, always doing more, rising higher. Everything will get better. It will still climbing after knowledge infinite. And 4 lines from the end, force us to wear ourselves and never rest until we reach that ripest fruit of all, that perfect bliss and sweet felicity, the sweet soul felicity, the sweet fruition of an earthly crown. Perhaps a little bit of overreach at the end there, a little bit of a falling off, since all of this energy seems like there ought to be somewhere a little more exciting to go than the sweet fruition of an earthly crown. But this is early stages of the English Renaissance theater, and Tamburlaine has no second thoughts at all. He reminds me of my younger son, who is getting ready to ride again for the 8th time in the Leadville 100-mile bike race, where he's determined at age 51 to do better than he did at 35. Little does he know. Ben Jonson. Born 1572, a little younger than Shakespeare, lives till 1637, quite a bit longer. His grandfather served Henry VIII, but before you get too excited about that, during Henry VIII's reign, practically everybody in England worked for Henry VIII in one way or another. He was an apprentice bricklayer himself. He went up to Cambridge University. Funny, they all went to Cambridge. Shakespeare did not. For a bit, he did not get a degree. He won a historic single combat in Flanders in the endless wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, and was honored for that. As I said, he acted with the Lord Strange's Admiral's men in the Rose Theatre, down where the Globe was built later. Lost to early death a daughter and 2 sons, 1 son to plague, not that unusual. Jailed in 1597 for writing a play called The Isle of Dogs that the censors didn't like. The censors were looking out for the crown and the crown only. And the very next year, he was jailed for killing Gabriel Spencer, an actor at the Rose Theatre where he was, in a duel. Pretty active guy. He was branded on his hand for that, got off of worse threats by benefit of clergy, which some of you may know about. If you could recite certain measures from the Bible, it was seen that you were saved and educated. A couple of the people in the Boston Massacre got off through benefit of clergy. He was boastful and satiric, obviously. In 1616, that's the year Shakespeare died, in 1616 he published his works, called opera, works in Latin, and it included his plays. This was seen as extraordinarily arrogant. Plays were not really literature. Plays were like film scripts or even scripts for situation comedies in Hollywood. They were not seen as high art that you would publish in a big, expensive book labeled opera. But, of course, by doing that, he also set a precedent that Shakespeare's fellows followed 7 years after he died. He said of Shakespeare, these guys all knew each other, he said of Shakespeare that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time, in a poem that's in the first folio of Shakespeare's plays. He wrote about 18 plays, about half as many as Shakespeare, one of which was, one of which was Volpone, the fox, the sly fox. He's a childless, lecherous man who, with the help of his wily servant Mosca, a fly if you know Italian, sets out to dupe everybody around him. The only redeeming qualities of the two of them is that those they were dupe were all just as nasty and selfish as they were, except for heavenly Celia, the faithful and boring wife of an aging lecher Corvino, the crow, a January-May marriage. The play opens with Volpone's fulsome hymn to gold that parallels Tamburlaine's hymn to power and aspiring minds that we looked at a minute ago, and then he makes his move on Celia. Why droops my Celia? Thou hast in place of a husband found a worthy lover. Use thy fortune well with secrecy and pleasure. See, behold what thou art queen of, not in expectation, the way I feed others, but possessed and crowned. See, here, a rope of pearl, each more orient than that the brave Egyptian queen caroused. Dissolve and drink 'em. See, a carbuncle may put out both the eyes of our St. Mark, play set in Venice. A diamond would have bought Lollia Paulina when she came in like starlight, hid with jewels that were the spoils of provinces. Take these and wear them and lose them, yet remains an earring to purchase them again. And this whole state, a gem but worth a patrimony, private patrimony, is nothing. We shall eat such at a meal. The heads of parrots, tongues of nightingales, the brains of peacocks and of ostriches shall be our food. And could we get the phoenix, though nature lost her kind, she were our dish. Wow. Don't worry about Celia, a cardboard hero named Bonario, who is hiding in a closet as part of a different bilking going on by Volpone, leaps out and shouts, "Forbear, foul ravisher, libidinous swine, free the forced lady or thou diest impostor." And Celia is able to escape. But what a temptation. Grotesquely hyperbolic. Each jewel worth more than you can imagine. The sheer creativity that lies behind Volpone, and of course, therefore, Johnson's imagination. But it does also begin to get a little kinky, doesn't it? Right in the middle, that the Egyptian queen dissolve and drink them, drinking, and this is going to become big towards the end of the passage. All these jewels he's described are nothing. We shall eat such at a meal. This is Tamburlaine's political, military overreaching, going a little crazy. Heads of parrots, tongues of nightingales. This is absurd. brains of peacocks and of ostriches shall be our food. And then something really quite sacrilegious. And could we get the phoenix? There's one phoenix on earth at a time, and the next one rises from the funeral pyre of the last one. And could we get the phoenix? Though nature lost her kind, she were our dish. Of course, the phoenix, to many in Shakespeare's audience, in Marlowe's audience, in Johnson's audience, had been connected with Jesus for obvious reasons, the idea of rebirth. So there's something both sacrilegious and also just wildly threatening. Though nature lost her kind, we still just eat her up at a meal. Volpone overreaches more than Tamerlane, but Johnson the poet is, I think, aware of this. William Shakespeare, born, we now know, April 21st, 1564, died April 23rd, 1616. On the left, a funerary sculpture put up less than 6 years after his death, so it's almost certainly a fair likeness. On the right, something called the Droshat portrait, the etching that is in the first folio. You can see a lot of similarities. Again, that's 7 years after his death, almost certainly by people who knew what he had looked like. Two more, one on the left called the Chandos portrait. They're named not for the artist, not for who they are, but for the person who owned them recently. And the one on the right I only put there because the world's largest Shakespeare entrepreneur, not necessarily the greatest scholar, but certainly a big entrepreneur, Shakespeare, Stanley Wells, argues that this also may well be a portrait of Shakespeare. A lot of people, me included, think it's Thomas of Overbury. We have a lot of other paintings of Thomas of Overbury, but we'll never know for sure. So Shakespeare married a well-pregnant Anne Hathaway quickly at 18. The announcement of the banns had to be sped up because she was quite pregnant. Somehow he got to London in the famously lost years that are entirely lost, but that doesn't keep people from filling them in. He was a sharer in his company. Every day after the production, after the performance, the money box would be taken upstairs and the money would be on the spot divided up among the sharers. There were never more than 10 or 11 of them, usually about 6 or 8. Shakespeare was one of them. As I mentioned, he had enough money to help buy the land on which they built the Globe Theatre. He was a sharer in the company. He lived well as a playwright and as a poet. 150 sonnets and some wonderfully sexy narrative poems. And he retires to his wife in Stratford at age 48 and dies 4 years later. The first folio matters here because we're going to look at a bit from Antony and Cleopatra. Had this book, big, heavy coffee table book, not been put together by former actors in his company 7 years after he died, half of the plays we know to be by Shakespeare would not exist. Half of the plays we have, including Antony and Cleopatra, only appear in this book. In honor of him, and to make a little money, I'm sure, they gathered together all of the plays that we now know of, except one, Troilus and Cressida. They gathered them all together, put them in this lovely, beautifully put together book that presumably cost about the equivalent of $150 in the day. In other words, well out of the reach, and that was without any binding, well out of the reach of most folks. A couple of my least favorite Antony and Cleopatra. A couple of my favorite, Sir Anthony Hopkins and Dame Judi Dench. The story, way too complicated. The only part, it's 42 scenes. Normal plays at the time of Shakespeare and his buddies were about 20 scenes, stretching all over the Mediterranean. Really hard to keep up with. Only need three things. First, we have Octavius Caesar, later Augustus. Some of you may well remember him from the Gospel of Luke, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. That's this guy. And then we have Antony, a Roman general, part of the ruling Roman triumvirate, three shared rulers. And then we have Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, who does seem to have slept with most of the leading Romans, including Julius Caesar and Pompey, in her efforts to defend herself against Rome. Antony and Cleopatra fall in love and pay the price, in Roman terms, for such frivolous things and die. Antony, at the end of Act 4, Shakespeare gives Cleopatra all of Act 5 to see, for us to see, what she can make of the dead Antony with all the copious language power of the English Renaissance. There's more on the next slide, but for now. Dolabella's a Roman who's come to, frankly, try to help Cleopatra a little bit and tell her that, yes, Caesar is going to take you in triumph to Rome. Humiliate her in public in Rome. Have her dragged behind his triumphal chariot. Cleopatra just ignores him and rolls right over him. I dreamt there was an emperor, Antony, oh, such another sleep that I might see but such another man. If it might please you, his face was as the heavens, and therein stuck a sun and moon, which kept their course and lighted the little O, the earth, most sovereign creature. His legs bestrid the ocean, his reared arm crested the world. His voice was propertied as all the tuned spheres, and that to friends. For when he meant to quail and shake the earth, he was as rattling thunder. For his bounty, there was no winter in it. And autumn it was that grew the more by reaping. His delights were dolphin-like. They showed his back above the element they lived in. In his livery walked crowns and crownets. Realms and islands were as plates dropped from his pocket. A lot of the same hyperbolic qualities of the ones we've looked at, but some differences. I dreamt there was an emperor, Antony, right up at the top. Oh, such another sleep that I might see, but such another man. Not that I might have such another dream, but that I might see, but such another man. Huge size, the Colossus at Rhodes, whose legs apparently did bestride some part of the port in Rhodes. He has a voice that has two ranges. Tamburlaine has one, it's fast forward. Two, and that's, his voice was property as all the tuned friends in that, all the tuned spheres in that to friends. But when he meant to quail and shake the orb, he was as rattling thunder. And then one of the magical moments in the play, for his bounty there was no winter in it, and autumn it was that grew the more by reaping. Did any of you, when you were a kid, dream there was a money tree, and as you took money off, more money appeared? Maybe it was where I grew up, but this is her vision of just constant bounty, generousness. Like love, the more you ask for, the more there is. His delights were dolphin-like. They showed his back above the element he lived in. In his livery, in his uniforms, in his colors, walked crowns and crownets. Okay, got to take a second. This is where you can tell the engineer from the English major. Ask you for a split second just to turn off your grown-up brain that you've been developing for 70, 80, 90 years. Turn it off and be the 4-year-old child for just a second, the one who sits under the table talking to the table and says, I love you, table, and the table says, you're going to go up and start talking to me, and you said, no, I'm not, table, I will always talk to you, and you did grow up and you did stop talking. Get back to that child and listen to what Shakespeare has given you before you turn it into something easy. In his livery walked crowns and crownets. Don't process it. In his livery walked crowns and crownets. It's a Disney, little crownets walking. It's a Disney moment. Now, of course, we grown-ups know it means people wearing crowns and people wearing crownets, but don't do that to the poetry. Give it its moment to do its magic. In his livery walked crowns and crownets. Something even bigger, much more attractive, much more impossible, but much more delightful than just the idea that, like Tamburlaine, he had people he'd beaten following along, or people, following along behind him. realms and islands were his plate, silver coins dropped from his pocket. Extraordinary what poetry can let us do if we will give it a chance and not immediately turn it into adult talk. All right, but there's more, isn't there? The outrageous nature of what she's asserting and asking, it's different from the outrageousness of Tamburlaine, just more, constant, always, sweet fruition of an earthly crown. And it's more balanced and less, it's no less extreme, but it's less curdling than the hyperbolic seduction offerings of Volpone to Celia. She knows she's creating, Cleopatra does. I dreamt, but then she commits to that dream. Antony and Cleopatra don't get the sweet fruition of an earthly crown from Tamburlaine, nor do they eat the tongues of nightingales and brains of peacocks, but they love. They imagine. They create a new kind of love, or at least Cleopatra tries to. Enough? Maybe not. There's more. Think if there was or might be such a man as this I dreamt of. Oh, gentle madam, no, you lie up to the hearing of the gods. But if there be nor ever were one such, it's past the size of dreaming. Nature wants stuff to vie strange forms with fancy, yet to imagine an Antony where nature's peace against fancy, condemning shadows quite, and there isn't anyone in the room who understands that. It is overwhelming. It's just too much stuff. How else can Shakespeare have Cleopatra describe an overwhelming feeling, except in some ways to overwhelm us? But it's not quite as overwhelming to Shakespeare's audience, to any world up before the Romantic poets, as it is to us, because we've lost a structure that they all knew deeply. The first part of it's sort of easy. You lie up to the hearing of the gods. But if there be nor ever were one such, it's past the size of dreaming. Okay, it's so great it's beyond dreaming. Although that nor, but if there be nor ever were one such, is a little surprising. You won't notice this consciously in the theater, but it pulls a little bit of it back, doesn't it? It should be an or, but if there be or, nor ever were one such, it's past the size of dreaming. The next half line is easy for us, I think, and certainly for Shakespeare's. Nature wants strange forms to vie with fancy. This goes back to Horace. As I say, it really is the dominant way of thinking. I think it has a lot of power in it today. Nature is real, but it's transient. It dies. Marcus Antonius on the natural level. Art is permanent, but it's unreal. Before the Romantic poets, no one ever imagined you could live in the world of the imagination. So that part's fairly easy. We don't just stuff our faces, we cook meals. You take the natural energies and appetites and you shape them into something finer. We don't rape, we woo. You take these passions, these energies, and through art, through the imagination, through fancy, through even shadows, we shape them into something finer. Obviously, that's part of what Cleopatra is doing in this whole speech. So nature wants stuff to vie strange forms with fancy. That's easy. Nature can't keep up with the imagination. The imagination is unreal, but of course it can surpass nature. But then she goes on and makes an outrageous claim, and you may want to walk out of the room, walk out of the theater. That's an absolutely valid response to this, but you got to hear what she's saying. She's saying to imagine an Antony where nature's masterpiece, masters assumed, against fancy, condemning shadows quite. She is saying that the ability to imagine an Antony is not an imagination's victory, it's nature's victory. She's shattering right in the middle of this period where everybody, I think we still in many ways accept that there's a natural human level, and then we strive for something finer, something higher. Whether it's from religious causes or social causes or humanitarian causes, we strive to improve on what nature gives us. She's claiming that to imagine an Antony would be nature's masterpiece against fancy, condemning shadows quite. As you say, it's outrageous. One can easily reject it. A lot of my students do. But you don't want to reject it without hearing what she's asking us to buy into. The dream of belief can be more real than the reality of disbelief. We live in a world where, on one hand, as the poet Auden says, the kitchen table exists because I scrub it. And where, on the other hand, passion and commitment can sometimes create dreams truer than waking. What are we little boys and girls made of? Our genetically hardwired biology things are very few indeed. Food, shelter, sleep, procreation. I'd like to say parental love, but if it's hardwired, someone didn't do a good job on the wiring with that in clearly all too many cases. But our cultural software, everything else is changeable. Almost all that makes us human. Altruistic, creative, imaginative, capable of reason, nobility, sacrifice, commitment, capacious, and we hope compassionate. And sadly, almost everything that makes us the only morally evil animal on the planet. All that software has been created by the human imagination and can be changed. It can be improved. The dream of belief can be more real than the reality of disbelief. I won't claim that the imagination is going to get us out of the national mess of mistrust and hate and abuse of power, overreaching, to use Tamerlane's term, that we are now in. But it can and it will shape hugely where we can go and where we choose to go when we do get out of this mess. To end with Pope Francis, we have to get our hearts to feel again. Thank you. I will take questions until the cows come home. Absolutely. Can we get, I think we're supposed to wait for mics because otherwise someone down here would like a mic? Well, it's almost here. And in the back of the room, you're going against the acoustics when you're facing me.
I'm Bernie Nakamura in Wallace. In 1994, my husband Bob and I were in London. Can you hear me? In 1994, my husband and I were in London, and I said, let's go find Shakespeare. I was a high school English teacher at the time in Reston, Virginia. And in 94, we found a small museum and learned that they were building the Globe Theater yet again, just in case you didn't know. So yes, it burned down twice, but it was being reconstructed in the mid-90s. And we learned that it was all by private donations. No government was involved in the cost. And that it would be rebuilt with, as nearly as possible, original materials, but yet, of course, with modern fireproof equipment. We were excited, and we went back we found out that you could become a friend of the Globe if you sent $500 American. That was the minimum donation to get a flagstone in the circular patio around the Globe with your name. So Bob and I did not want to spend $500, but I did a fundraiser at our high school in Reston, Virginia.
Good.
And on Shakespeare's birthday, which we treated as the 23rd
Of course.
at the time, the following year, on his birthday, we sent our money to London.
Great.
At that time, I used the school office, and the office had a fax machine. That was as current as we were. So I faxed the money. They faxed back and said, what would you like your flagstone to say? You have 3 lines. And I said, South Lakes High School, Virginia, USA. And they wrote back and said, everybody knows that Virginia is in the USA. So would you like to use your 3 lines differently? And I wrote back by fax, South Lakes High School, Reston, Virginia. The reason I'm telling you about that transaction is that several years later, students of mine went to see the globe. We have 2 flagstones. Both of them were placed for the same $500.
Good. Good. Thank you. Nice story. Yeah. It is a wonderful reconstruction. Of course, it's not identical because of fire laws. Shakespeare's Theater could possibly hold 3,000 people. Huge. But it wasn't get out when you want. It was first in, last out. In other words, you slid in, there was no room at all. Huge size, though, to be spoken to, even though it's contained in walls, by an actor. So they were powerful voices projecting to as many as 3,000 people. Well, other concerns, questions? It's on. No, it isn't. There you go.
There we go. I had thought from the title that maybe you haven't explored it. Have you explored at all what you might think was the writing environment? In other words, do you think, much like plays today are taken to Washington and Philadelphia before they get to New York, and the lines change, and sometimes the music changes, and the thing develops? Do you think a lot of these plays developed, and maybe what was the environment that Shakespeare was in that might have been full of ideas and things else that he might have picked up? And how these things may have developed?
Right. One of my colleagues, on the first day of class, he just draws a big ear. He says that what Shakespeare is an ear. He hears everything going on around him in London. Yes, the plays are a little different from what you're implying, because the plays has to be approved by the director of the Revels. In other words, it had to pass the censors, and if you changed it after that, you could get in trouble. But we know that when plays went on the road, when plague broke out, as it regularly did in London, and theaters were closed down, these acting companies sometimes went on the road outside of London. Almost certainly they took fewer actors and cut lines. Hamlet played today, if any of you have seen the full Kenneth Branagh version, it's over 5 hours. We can't, now granted, that's because we play slower. We're not an audience used to taking in most of our information through our ears. We're used to taking through our eyes. I think it was, what I said about copia, I think it was a time in which every author was thrilling in the powers of language. The sort of medieval settle down of language under the strict or sort of order of the Christian church was breaking up, and all kinds of experiments were going on, and all of these playwrights, as I said, they all knew each other. So undoubtedly, we have no evidence they traded manuscripts back and forth, but the fact that Shakespeare takes a line from Marlowe and puts it in the mouth of a character, counting on, presumably, a lot in his audience to recognize it, shows that there's a lot of awareness that we are the new theater guys. We're the angry young men of the 60s who are bringing this theater that didn't exist. I mean, the paid-for theater didn't exist until really 1576, when Shakespeare's 12 years old. That's a tiny answer. Someone over there, Rodney, is waving for a mic.
Also, we have to remember, and I know you know this, we're dealing with a time in history when like today, the people of this time knew of Commedia dell'arte and various other characters that these playwrights picked up and said, okay, here we have this character you're all familiar with. You people down in the lower loges here, let me play to you with this character. You people up there in the higher, high-paid areas, I have these characters in the back here who are going to play to you because they're playing the royals. It was amazing. This man was a genius. And he used, as you've asked, he used everything these people knew and brought them life in this little enclosed space and opened up their imaginations. It's amazing.
Yeah. One slight modification. It pretty well established that, in fact, Shakespeare's theater was, as theater is today, largely a middle-class operation. The idea that these savage, unknowing groundlings came in, it cost a sixth of a day's wages of a master carpenter to get into the theater, 1 penny. Master carpenter earned 6 pence a day. That's roughly what, at $50, $60 a ticket, they cost today. But everything else you said about gathering all of this stuff and playing to various levels, absolutely. But unfortunately, like most of the world, the middle class and the moneyed classes end up doing better than those with less. We got time for one more? I'm fine, but.
So, unfortunately, we've run out of time. This is not on, is it?
No, Jesse, I asked Jesse to turn it off.
All right, I'll speak loudly. We have run out of time, but I think that Sandy will stay here and answer your questions from the front of the stage for a little while. So thank you, Sandy, very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I'd like to just remind you all that the next Keese performance is From Slavery to Freedom, African Americans in Montgomery County and Women of the Underground Railroad. That's a long title. Cheryl Spencer is the speaker. She is the Cultural Resources Museum Manager for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. She will address the question of what it was like to be enslaved in Maryland, and especially what enslavement meant if you were a woman. The host will be Jim Hathaway. It will be Thursday, April 24th, 7:30, right here in